We'll just have 5 minutes of questions. But my general take on what's been said by these first two speakers is that if you are in that average, and you're not in that top 20%, life on the land is going to be pretty tough over the next decade or so. So I guess that is the real drive for everyone to try to be above that. And I guess that's sort of life generally. But when you're running a business and you start looking at some of those graphs and hence the figures behind them that were put up there, it's a fairly sobering sort of thought. But anyway, look, we will take a couple of questions. So if anyone would like to put their hand up, and please, if you do ask a question, make it a question and not a statement because we haven't got a lot of time. Yes, over here.
I was just interested in the Tedra. Is it frost resistant, and has it got a deep root system, and what soils does it thrive in?
Yes, yes and yes.
Is it available in the northeast?
Not yet. Yes to the first two, which were frost resistance, and what was the second one? Sorry, second part of the question.
Deep root system.
Deep rooted, yes, yes. It's perennial.
And the soil type.
Look, I think to date it's been grown on a variety. I mean, the photo I had up there was WA, where I considered it to be a bit like a beach, even though they considered it to be one of their better soils. Certainly being established in quite a diverse range of environments now, and I don't think we're seeing major soil constraints at this stage. But it's early days, and I mean, when I talk about it, people say, well, where can I buy a bag of seed? Unfortunately, it's going to be a few years till you can actually buy a bag or two of seed. But it's just, I guess, one of those things that is coming down the pipeline that if it looks very promising, and we've got a lot to learn, but if it lives up, as I said, to half of what it's promising, it will be a really interesting plant in our systems.
And is it a broadleaf?
A broadleaf, yes. Yes, I suppose you call it a broadleaf.
And it
Phil
makes
Graham's nodding. He knows more about narrow leaves and broadleaves than I do, obviously.
And it's good for hay as well?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Lucinda's shaking her head. No, there's a lot of stuff still to be done, but it just looks like a really interesting plant.
And John Sykes, I'm interested that neither of you mentioned the role of scale, in other words, size in the farms. In northeast Victoria particularly, we probably have a problem with scale. Do you think it's important, and how are we going to develop it over the next 10 years if it is?
Scale, certainly I would say that scale is important. The ability to drive down your overhead costs is things like labour is really dependent on scale. And certainly I can appreciate your point about northeast Victoria being overrun with weekenders and things like that, which is not helping with land price. But look, certainly when you look at some, I guess, rules of thumb or benchmarks, for lack of a better word, I mean, we see people who've got scale efficiency. I mean, we're looking at farms of 10, 15, 20,000 DSEs per labour unit, and obviously you need a tremendous amount of scale for that sort of thing in order to generate a good return from operating. So certainly I guess your capital appreciation, depending on what that might be, might also help to offset your annual returns, but you don't realise that till you sell. So yeah, scale very important.
I agree. I think we need to look at it in a couple of different ways. One is that there are clear benefits to scale for small farms. So if you've got, say, a $2 million farm versus a $5 million farm, assuming it's an agricultural operation, not a hobby, most hobby farms aren't worth $5 million anyway. There's a clear benefit in terms of economic efficiency of the $5 million farm versus the $2 million farm. Yeah, and so that's 5,000 DSE versus 10 or 15,000 DSE or equivalent in cropping. I think it's quite interesting actually when you then get to larger scale operations, $7 to $10 million total investment, and I think it actually plateaus. So it rises, and then probably, certainly from the evidence I've seen, it plateaus, and maybe there's somewhere between 7 million and 20 million, there's not much advantage, and even there's some evidence when you get very large, you get diseconomies of scale. So we've looked at farm businesses that are, we think, too large to run as an efficient unit, and actually divide them up into 3 management units. So, look, I think it's a key issue. I mean, the key thing that hurts small farms is the overhead costs. The big one is the labour. So if you are in a small farm, one way to fix that is to treat your farm as a weekend job and go and get a proper job during the week. And then that addresses a lot of it. And then you structure your machinery ownership with contracting and various things to get around it. So, yeah, look, I think there's an inexorable trend to increasing farm size, basically, and without it, and that's part of the reason we need farmers to leave, is that the farmers on the smaller farms aren't viable. We need provide capacity for all farmers to get larger, because that's part of how we improve our business and get productivity over time.
Should we be rethinking our love affair with planting gum trees on our farms? Because we are setting ourselves up for an uncertain future. If anybody's read Bill Gamage's book, The Biggest Estate on Earth, it is a very good read to go back to the landscape that we took over when we first came into this land, and it's a very educational and thought-provoking book. So I'd like to base my question to you on whether you've read that book and whether we should be rethinking our love of gum trees.
Well, I think we're stuck with the native vegetation we've got. So the issue is about how we make our properties and small towns and larger towns safe. So there's some issues there, I think, around defensive space. Then I think what we need to do is make sure our planning rules don't allow us to create additional problems in the future. At the moment, I think they do, through subdivision. So it's not so much, and I don't, I think even in terms of biodiversity conservation, a lot of, particularly in the northeast Victoria, we haven't got to put more gum trees back in the environment. That's my view. We need to manage the ones that are there. We've got, we've been blessed with all of these hillscapes in the various alpine valleys that are largely still treed. So it's that interface between public and private land where our efforts should be, and trying to protect the integrity of those large intact landscapes. So that's in terms of the biodiversity conservation, but I think it's more about what we do in the future with our planning rules.
Allan Curtis, I think, would be the one. We've got this disease creeping over agricultural land at the moment, and we've probably all got to face up to some sort of solutions with it, and this is called urban sprawl, especially in your nice little places where you live. Everyone wants to go to a place like that, have a nice little block, a toy farm type of thing. Do we get to a stage sometime when we've got to actually evaluate how good a lot of land is and try and preserve it, and still give value to those farmers that want to transfer that sort of land, and try to restrict a lot more urban development on particularly sort of more unproductive land? So really, do we look at land types and try to base our urban development on land types?
Well, there are approaches in other places that have worked to do that. The Europeans have got a history of having very sharp urban edges, and they seem to be able to maintain those. They've got the discipline in many cases it's political will to ensure that they hold. So that's part of it. The other part is that you can, in the United States, there are some innovative approaches to purchasing development rights so that you can retain land for its landscape value or agricultural production value to avoid subdivision. In other words, you can pay a landholder, a current generation, to remove the subdivision potential of that property. You can't do that everywhere, but it's possible to do that. Local and state governments have got a lot of power in terms of land use planning, and voters need to influence those decisions. I think that's about all I can say.
Presently, I'm sitting on a committee for Yass Shire Council looking at this exact issue, because we've got the same problem up there being near Canberra. It's the planning rules, and what we've decided we think the best thing is is to concentrate on what do we have to do to maintain as bigger areas we can in productive agriculture, and then work out what subdivision policy we put in place that's going to achieve that objective. And the major thing we're coming up with, the policy's got to have flexibility. So in New South Wales, there's no flexibility. It's a minimum lot size depending on shires. That really doesn't give landholders flexibility to handle successional changing or succession and things like that. So it was an interesting. Yass Council was the first one to do it, and about 4 other councils. There's about 15 of us have sat around the room for a number of meetings, but I think we've finally got to the point where we've got some agreement. The issue will be whether we can get flexibility through the state planning mob.
This is to Allan, mainly, I think. You touched on it briefly, but I think looking forward to 10 to 20, 30 years on, the earlier speakers talked about lowering costs, majorly costs of production. Whether it's big or small business, everyone's trying to push down the cost of labour. And you implied more of that with looking at India and with the influence of Asian competition, and also from China. How far down do you think the standard of living looking forward 10, 20, 30 years, because the disposable income is going to go down if the wages are forced down? How far down do you think the standard of living might be in 20, 30 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't give you that answer. My guess is that rather than expecting Asia to come up, I think living standards here are likely to go down. That's my guess. It's just a guess. If you're in North America and you talk to people there about the cost of employing a plumber or a carpenter in Australia, they just look at you as though you're on another planet. It's $12 or $18 an hour, $20 an hour in America for a qualified tradesperson. So there are those sorts of issues. So I think there might be some balance there. But yeah, I agree. I think with some of the comments before, if you're a landholder, you've really got to keep your costs under control. You can't expect prices to keep floating up and getting you out of strife. Maybe land prices will, but you've got to be prepared to realise that capital gain. And not everybody wants to do that, either by borrowing against it or selling or subdividing. So there are some issues there. I think it's, part of the issue for me is that I can see lots of agricultural production coming out of South America and even Africa in the future. Large parts of Europe are underutilised. There's potential, with climate change, so you've probably heard this, in Russia and in Canada for increased production there. So I don't see any really, I think we've really got to work with what we've got at the moment. And I think the point that was made before about doing the best you possibly can with the enterprises that you understand. And in Victoria, a lot of us have also got, there's off property income, so that I think does build resilience in. The question is, well, can you get economies of scale? And one opportunity to do that is to lease land. And that's there. We see in the Wimmera quite a bit of leasing of land to get increased scale, not just purchasing the land. But I can't give you any greater insights than those.
Chris, I've got one question for Lucinda with her role on the board of MLA. I guess I've often wondered, and maybe I'm incorrect in this assumption, but MLA and GRDC, the universities cry out they don't get enough graduates coming through the system, and they're probably winding down their agricultural courses largely. I guess my question is, why aren't the research bodies investing directly in that end of education of that particular age group or demographic? We don't see a lot of co-investment or investment in those university courses from the people who take our funds, if you like.
So you're suggesting that producers' levies are invested in the national university system? Is that your question?
Well, that's basically it, I guess, because we all have a vested interest in graduates coming through and adding value to our industries down the track.
Our statutory funding agreement with the federal government is really clear about where we can invest, and so I'm not sure that investing in universities would even be considered part of that, but MLA does have a human capacity, a very strong capacity portfolio, and that includes, funding in things like PIXI, which is the Primary Industry Science Education Committee, and that's a national a national strategy to get kids in high school studying science-based courses which will lead to their interest in food production and agriculture. There's also the Primary Industries Education Foundation, and we support some of the strategies in that. Plus we have, we don't have a lot of undergraduate support, we have quite a lot of postgraduate support, and we have a new program in postgraduate mentoring, trying to attract people in the skills areas where we're losing research capacity, and there's quite a lot of researchers in Australia reaching retirement age in some really key capacity areas that we are going to need in the future, such as agricultural economics, and we could name a host of them. So there is some strategic investment in those areas to make sure we've got that sort of capacity. But yes, I mean, you're asking a question about, you know, do we transfer funds to universities? I'm not sure that would be an appropriate mechanism for producer levies.
I mean, it would be unrealistic to expect the industry-funded bodies to be investing in undergraduate education. Yeah, the scale we're talking about, education is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It doesn't need that sort of support. What has been critical for us has been the support of the industry-funded R&D corps for postgraduate scholarships and PhDs, and the partnerships that have been built between industry bodies and researchers through things like Future Farm Industry CRC or the GRDCs and so forth. So I think, you know, there's a really positive story there. I think the industry-funded R&D corps have punched well above their weight in terms of shaping postgraduate training and influencing research in particularly our university at Charles II.
I think there's a bigger problem than the reason universities are cutting back on the courses because the kids aren't putting their hand up to do it. I think one of the big problems is, and it was mentioned earlier, for too long, us who work in agriculture run it down. And my partner's a careers advisor in the high school system. You talk to kids about going into agriculture and boy, they think she's on another planet. If we want people, good people to be in agriculture, we've got to sell it as an industry with a future and with merit, and we don't do it.
Sorry, I'll just say one more thing. I've seen some really exciting things recently. I met a lady who's in the dairy industry at Jamboree, a lady called Lynn Strong, and she started this thing called Art for Agriculture, and they provide the schools with a sort of a life-size cow, and they have a competition at the Royal Shows, and this is starting to sort of take off, but at the moment it's in primary schools in Western Sydney. And they have to decorate them with, they pick a theme, like they pick the grains industry, and they decorate the cow with all the things about a grains industry. So the top of the cow was a toaster with the bread popping up and all the data about what Australia produces in terms of value of the grains industry. And, I mean, you've got to find things which appeal to today's, I guess we're on the Z generation, or the millenniums, or whatever they're called. It can't be just push from the industry. It's got to really be pull from. We've got to create pull within, the young students of today. And I think there's a lot of talk going on around the country, and I hope we start to see some action and some results.